The day Sasha Holm was brought to her knees in the middle of St. Calder Regional's main lobby, she had been on shift for 11 hours and had not eaten since 5 that morning. That detail matters, not because hunger made her weak, but because it says everything about the kind of nurse she was. The kind who skips lunch to stay with a frightened 83-year-old through a procedure no one had explained to him properly. The kind who memorizes her patients' coffee orders alongside their medication schedules, not because anyone asked her to, but because it's the difference between care and kindness. And Sasha Holm had always believed both mattered equally. She had been at St. Calder for 6 years. 6 years of overnight shifts and double backs, of holding hands through grief and watching families try to absorb news that would change the shape of their lives forever. She was 29 years old, and people who didn't know her assumed, from her quietness, that she was younger. She had clear gray eyes and a habit of tucking her brown hair back with whatever she could reach. A spare pen, a rubber band from the supply closet, and she moved through the ER with a kind of focused calm that newer nurses mistook for coldness until they watched her work a difficult case, and then they understood. She was not cold. She was steady. There is a difference. Her name badge still read Holm rather than Sauer, which she'd kept professionally when she married Reed 2 years ago, and which sometimes made her smile in a complicated way when she thought about it. About the distance between who Reed Sauer was in the world, what he'd done, what he'd survived, the things he carried, and the small silver badge pinned over her heart that held only her name and her title and the hospital's founding seal. Reed had been deployed for 6 months by then. Army Ranger. Second tour overseas since they'd been married, and she didn't ask for details about where or why, because she'd learned early that some things lived better in silence, and Reed was careful about what he brought home to her. What he did bring home on his first tour was Flint, a Belgian Malinois retired from active duty after a field injury that had healed cleanly but permanently. Reed had submitted the adoption paperwork before the ink was dry on the discharge form. "He saved my life twice," Reed told her the night he came home with Flint on a lead, the dog regarding her with amber eyes that seemed to already know her. "I wasn't leaving him in a facility." Flint slept at the foot of their bed and met her at the door every evening with the same patient, golden attention, and in the months Reed was gone, she had grown to love that dog in a way she hadn't anticipated. He was steady, like her. He waited without urgency. He didn't need to be told twice. She thought about Reed and Flint on the morning of October 14th, which she would later think of as the worst day of her career. Not because what happened was the worst thing she'd witnessed. She'd been a nurse long enough that her ranking of worst things had shifted considerably. But because it was the first time she had been made to feel ashamed of who she was in front of people who had no right to make her feel that way. It started with Gray Dunfield. His family's name was on the wall of the cardiology wing. The Dunfield Cardiovascular Suite, funded by a 7-figure donation, announced at a ribbon cutting attended by the hospital's entire board. Gray Dunfield Sr. had been a patient at St. Calder before Sasha ever arrived. Gray Dunfield Jr., who'd gone by Gray since college because the full name felt too heavy, was 38 years old, twice divorced, and accustomed to a particular quality of attention from anyone wearing a hospital badge. His father had been admitted to the cardiac unit 4 days prior. Sasha wasn't even his father's nurse. She was ER, and the elder Dunfield was stable and 3 floors up. But Gray had wandered into the emergency wing looking for someone to complain to about the parking validation process, and he had encountered Sasha coming out of a supply room, and something about the interaction had gotten under his skin. She hadn't recognized him immediately. He'd given his name without context, and she'd said, politely, that she wasn't the right person for his concern and offered to direct him to patient services. He'd looked at her the way certain men look at women who don't respond the way they expect. The parking matter got resolved by someone else, but Gray Dunfield didn't forget. On October 14th at noon, a hospital administrator named Trent Odom pulled Sasha out of a room mid-charting to tell her that a complaint had been filed. A formal one. Gray Dunfield had told the chief of staff that a nurse matching Sasha's description had removed his father's personal property from the bedside table during a visit to the cardiac unit. Which visit, Sasha said. I wasn't in the cardiac unit. Odom looked at his tablet in the way people look at things when they already know what they're about to say is going to cause a problem. He says you were there Monday morning, around 7. Monday morning, she had been in the ER from 6 to 2. She had 14 patients she could name. She had documentation. She said all of this. Odom said he was sure it would get sorted out, but protocol required that she accompany him, and there would need to be a brief meeting with Dr. Tull present, given that Tull was the attending overseeing the complaint process for the week. Dr. Brendan Tull. She kept her face neutral when she heard the name. She had learned that technique specifically for situations involving Dr. Tull. Brendan Tull had been at St. Calder for 11 years. He was 54, gray at the temples, and possessed of the particular confidence that comes from having never been seriously challenged in a professional environment. He was not incompetent. Sasha had been careful, over the years, to be precise about that distinction. He was a competent physician. He was also the kind of man who interpreted thoroughness in his subordinates as impertinence, and who had a long memory for anyone who questioned him. 7 months earlier, Sasha had flagged a medication discrepancy on a patient handed off from Tull's team. The patient had been fine. The error had been caught. Sasha had followed protocol exactly as written. Tull had not been formally sanctioned, but the report had gone into the system, and Tull knew who had filed it. He had been professionally civil to her since then. Civil in the way of a man biding time. When Sasha walked into the administrative conference room at the end of the main lobby corridor, she found not just Odom and Tull, but Gray Dunfield seated at the table, and 2 members of the Board of Trustees, both of whom she recognized from the donor wall, standing near the windows. The room felt arranged, not like a meeting, like something else. Gray Dunfield looked at her with the particular expression of a man who has already decided how the next 20 minutes are going to go. Dr. Tull stood when she entered. He did not look at her face. Miss Holm, he said, not nurse, not even her proper title. We have a rather serious matter to address. She said she understood, and she sat down, and she folded her hands on the table. What happened over the next 10 minutes, the careful, circling language, the references to hospital reputation, Gray Dunfield's account of a watch, a gold watch, that had supposedly been on his father's bedside table and was now missing, the way Dr. Tull nodded along with patient solemnity each time Gray spoke, felt to Sasha like being submerged, like watching the surface of water recede above her. She answered each question clearly. She had not been in the cardiac unit Monday morning. She had documentation. She had never met Gray Dunfield's father. She had never been in that room. Gray Dunfield said, very calmly, that he was certain of what he saw. Dr. Tull said that in situations like these, when a donor family had concerns, the hospital had an obligation to take those concerns seriously, and that pending a full investigation, it might be appropriate for Miss Holm to accept a temporary reassignment. You're removing me from the ER, she said. Temporarily, Tull said, as a precaution. She looked at him. He looked at the table. One of the board members shifted his weight near the window. Sasha said quietly that she would like union representation present before any formal action was taken. Dr. Tull said this wasn't a formal action, it was a conversation, and that her response was frankly making things more complicated than they needed to be. She took the watch, Gray Dunfield said, with the flat certainty of a man who has never been told no by anyone who worked in a building with his family's name on it. I want a formal apology. On the record. The meeting moved into the lobby. She wasn't sure later exactly how it happened. She remembered Dr. Tull saying something about transparency, about the hospital's commitment to its donor families, and then they were in the corridor and then through the doors into the main lobby, the wide, carpeted entrance hall where patients' families moved slowly between the elevator banks and the information desk and the coffee cart near the north windows. There were people everywhere. A man in a wheelchair near the seating area, a young mother with 2 small children at the information desk, hospital volunteers in their green vests, 2 nurses from the 3rd floor on their way to the elevator who stopped when they saw Sasha's face. Dr. Tull addressed her in the lobby, in front of all of them. He said the hospital took these matters seriously. He He said the Dunfield family had been patients and benefactors for over 20 years and that their concerns warranted a response. He said that a formal apology, offered openly, would go a long way toward resolving the situation quickly and preserving everyone's professional standing. She understood then what was actually happening. This was not a conversation. This was a performance arranged for an audience. Gray Dunfield stood slightly behind Tull's right shoulder, arms crossed, watching her with an expression that wasn't quite smug. It was more certain than smug, more final, as though the outcome had already been decided and he was simply waiting for the closing of a door. Sasha looked at Dr. Tull. She looked at Gray Dunfield. She looked at the board members who had followed them into the lobby and were now standing near the reception desk with the careful, absent expressions of men who are watching something happen without choosing to stop it. She was aware of the nurses from the third floor, frozen near the elevator. She was aware of the young mother at the information desk who had stopped talking to the volunteer and was watching. She thought about the watch she had never touched. She thought about the cardiac unit she had never entered on Monday morning. She thought about 6 years and the patients she had held in the dark and the ones she had stayed with past the end of her shift because there was nobody else. Dr. Tull said her name again. And something in Sasha Holm, not her strength, which was intact, but her capacity to keep arguing in a space that had been arranged specifically to make her feel small, gave out just for a moment. Her lanyard slipped from her neck without her noticing. She crouched to pick it up from the floor, gathered it from the tile, and the motion froze her there for a few seconds too long, one hand flat against the ground, and when she looked up, Dr. Tull was looking down at her, and Gray Dunfield was looking down at her, and the whole lobby was looking at her. She heard one of the third-floor nurses say something she couldn't make out. She was about to stand. She was about to stand and say, clearly and deliberately, that she was not going to apologize for something she did not do, and that if the hospital intended to pursue this, they would do it through proper channels with proper representation when the lobby's main doors opened. Later, she would try to remember the exact sound of it. The automatic doors had a particular hiss and thud she had stopped consciously hearing years ago, the way you stop hearing the specific rhythm of a building you work in every day. She heard it that day. She heard the doors open, and beneath the ambient noise of the lobby, she heard the particular sound of a working dog's nails on tile. She was still crouched near the floor when she turned her head. Reed Sauer stood in the entrance of St. Calder Regional Medical Center in his uniform, camo still on, a duffel over one shoulder, 6 months of distance on his face that hadn't finished clearing yet, and he had Flint's lead in his left hand, and Flint was already looking at her with those amber eyes, and Reed was looking at her too, and whatever he saw in that moment completed its assessment in about 3 seconds. He had been planning to surprise her. She understood this immediately and completely. He had landed early, gotten a ride to the hospital from the airfield, brought Flint because he always brought Flint. He had probably been smiling for most of the drive, thinking about her face when she saw him. He was not smiling now. He crossed the lobby without hurrying. Flint moved at his side with the smooth, contained energy of a dog trained to read a situation, and the dog's focus had shifted to the 2 men standing over Sasha in a way that was entirely professional and entirely unmistakable. Sasha, Reed said, just her name, looking at her, not at them. She stood. She was steady when she stood. Reed looked at Dr. Tull. He looked at Gray Dunfield. He looked at the board members near the desk. The look was not aggressive. It was something more careful than aggressive. Something that came from 6 months overseas and 11 years in service before that, and from being the kind of man who has learned to read a room the way most people read a clock, quickly, accurately, without sentiment. My wife, he said, to no one in particular, is not going to apologize for something she didn't do. Dr. Tull blinked. He looked at Reed's uniform, at the rank insignia, at the dog. He said, with the careful authority of a man who has held a room for 20 years, that this was a hospital matter, and that he wasn't sure Reed had the full picture of the situation. I have enough of it, Reed said. Gray Dunfield said, recalculating, that this had nothing to do with the military, and that it was really a matter between his family and the hospital staff. Flint sat. It wasn't a threatening gesture. The dog simply sat at Reed's left side and oriented himself toward Gray Dunfield with the focused, unhurried attention of an animal trained for exactly this kind of high-tension stillness, and the effect on Gray Dunfield was immediate and involuntary. He stepped back half a step without seeming to notice he'd done it. "I understand," Reed said, his voice level, "that you've accused my wife of theft, and that a physician who outranks her used that accusation to bring her into a public space without union representation and demand a public apology." He looked at Dr. Tull. "Is that an accurate summary?" Dr. Tull said it was considerably more nuanced than that. Reed said he'd be happy to discuss the nuances. He asked, first, whether there was any documentation of Sasha in the cardiac unit on Monday morning, or whether the hospital was acting on a verbal accusation from a family member without pulling badge logs or reviewing camera footage. The silence that followed lasted about 4 seconds. One of the board members cleared his throat. What came out in the next hour was not dramatic, it was simply thorough. Hospital security pulled the access log for the cardiac unit on Monday morning. Sasha's badge had not been scanned on that floor at any point during her shift. The ER camera footage, which Sasha had mentioned twice, and which no one had thought to pull before staging this meeting in the lobby, showed her clearly at the nursing station, from 6:18 a.m. through her first patient intake at 6:42. The watch, it turned out, had been moved by Gray Dunfield's father himself, tucked into the drawer of his bedside table the previous night. The elder Mr. Dunfield confirmed this with some irritation when reached by phone. He had moved it himself because the cleaning staff vacuumed near the table, and he worried about the vibration. He had told no one because he had assumed it was obvious. Gray Dunfield did not apologize. Men like Gray Dunfield rarely do, not in the moment. He went quiet instead. Very quiet, very interested in his phone, and when the board members spoke in low voices near the window and then excused themselves, he followed shortly after. His footsteps crossed the lobby, and then he was through the doors and gone, and the space he left behind felt, to everyone remaining, noticeably cleaner. Dr. Tull said very little. He made a reference to the situation having been mishandled and the confusion being regrettable. He said this to a point slightly above Sasha's left shoulder, and then he too left. Trent Odom stood in the emptying lobby with the expression of a man composing a very difficult email in his head. The nurses from the 3rd floor had missed their elevator. They were still there, standing near the seating area, and when Sasha looked over at them, one of them, a woman named Presley Wayne, who had been at St. Calder for 2 years and who Sasha had trained through her first solo overnight shift, looked back at her with an expression that said everything she didn't say aloud. Sasha sat down on one of the lobby benches with her back straight and her hands in her lap, and Flint put his head on her knee without being asked, and she breathed. Reed sat beside her. He still had his duffel on his shoulder. He had been in that country for 6 months and in transit for 22 hours, and the first thing he had done after walking through the door of the place his wife worked was stand beside her in a lobby full of strangers and refuse to let something unjust go unchallenged. She thought about saying that. She thought about telling him he could have simply taken her home. She already knew what he would say. He would say he'd seen her on the floor, and that was that. "How did you know?" she said finally. "What was happening?" He was quiet for a moment. "You were crouched down, and there were 2 men standing over you, and you weren't looking at either of them." He paused. "I know what you look like when you're choosing not to react." She looked at him. After 6 months, she'd almost forgotten the specific quality of his attention. The way he looked at her like she was the fixed point in the room, the thing everything else organized itself around. She felt something in her chest release that she hadn't known she'd been holding. "I would have stood up," she said, "on my own." "I know," he said. "I wasn't worried about that." Flint's tail moved once against the floor. The lobby had returned to its ordinary rhythm, the elevator chime, the soft announcement over the PA, the information desk volunteer offering directions to the 4th floor waiting room, as though the last hour had simply been weather passing through. "I missed you," she said. "Yeah," Reed said. He reached over and settled her lanyard back around her neck carefully, the way he always straightened the things that she left crooked. I missed you too. 2 weeks later, Dr. Brendan Tull accepted a position at a hospital in another state. The official announcement cited a mutual agreement and a new professional direction, which is the language of institutional exits that means everything and says nothing. The cardiac unit access logs and the ER footage had been reviewed by 2 additional administrators by then, and whatever conversations followed behind closed doors, Sasha was not asked to be part of them. She was not asked to be part of a lot of things that happened in the weeks after October 14th. Mostly she was simply allowed to work, which was all she had ever asked for. She never heard from Gray Dunfield again. She thought sometimes about what that day would have looked like if Reed's flight had landed on schedule instead of early. She thought about whether she would have stood up, eventually, and said what needed saying, and she believed she would have. She was steady. She had always been steady. She had 6 years of evidence for that, cataloged in patient files and shift reports, and the particular way the overnight nurses nodded at her when she came in to relieve them, which meant thank you for being someone we trust. But she also thought about the lobby full of people and the 2 men standing above her and how long a single moment can feel when you're carrying it alone. How much easier it is to find your footing when someone is already there beside you. Not because you can't stand on your own, but because standing and standing with someone are simply not the same experience, and pretending otherwise is a particular kind of loneliness dressed up as strength. Flint slept at the foot of their bed that night and didn't move until morning. Reed's duffel sat unpacked by the closet door, which meant he was home and intended to stay for a while, and Sasha lay in the dark listening to the quiet of the house and to the slow, easy rhythm of 2 people and 1 dog who had found their way back to the same room, and she let herself feel it fully, the relief of it, the ordinary, irreplaceable weight of it. Some things you spend years building, some things you only understand in the moment you almost lose them. Sasha Holm had spent 6 years building something in that hospital, a reputation, a record, a presence her patients knew and trusted and counted on in the way that people count on things they cannot afford to lose. She had not lost it on October 14th. It had never been in danger of being lost, not really, because the things that are true about you do not disappear because someone with authority and a loud voice insists otherwise. They wait. They wait, and the records hold, and the footage is there, and the colleagues who watched from across the lobby remember what they saw, and eventually, one way or another, the truth comes back into the light. It always does.